If we can identify those donors who are more likely to churn, Duke Athletics could target those individuals with different promotional material to discourage churn. So our project aimed to understand who was more likely to churn and the reasons why, and we did so by using internal and supplementary data to create predictive models. Duke Athletics provided us with certain files detailing account profiles, donor profiles, season ticket and single ticket sales. And we took in supplemental data such as median income per zip code, unemployment rate per zip code, sport recruitment data, and tax rates.
So moving on to results, looking at figure 1, we noticed that donors who donated over a longer period of time are less likely to churn. And then in reference to the 2 models that we created a random forest model that had 84% accuracy and a light GBM model that had 86% accuracy. In terms of precision recall and F1 scores for both of these models, it predicted that for those predicted to not have churned, these scores were significantly higher compared to those that have predicted to have churned. So for those who predicted to not have churned, the scores were all around 0.9. And while the scores for those predicted to have churned were about 0.4, but the light GBM scores in general were higher than the random forest scores. And then moving on to figure 2, we can see that with the AUC was high, for both models about 0.77, and then in figure 3 we saw that some important features in our model were lifetime amount and total years.
So in conclusion, I think the most important thing that we wanted to do for Duke Athletics was to give them obviously the most predictive model, but also just give them insights into the process so that they can optimize the different decisions that they make. So as Hannah has already mentioned, we realized that total years that a donor has been active and the lifetime amount that they've donated were very significant determinants of whether they're likely to churn or not. And we saw that as donors who are still young within their donor journey, we've just donated for a very short while, tend to have high likelihood of churning. So Duke Athletics might want to then focus on those type of donors when they're still early in the process of their donor journey. Another thing as well is that that for next steps is that Duke, for whoever's going to take this, is that Duke Athletics might want to focus on. We've just split it up into churn and no churn, but they might want to split up the churn event into those that are churning or those that are engaging in voluntary, what we call voluntary churn, and involuntary churn being, let's say, for example, death or for financial reasons. Because the involuntary churn donors, there's nothing that Duke Athletics can really do with them. So it will be a waste of resources to them to try and engage with. That's just a summary for our projects. If we will take questions now.
So thank you very much. And this is meant to simulate the casualness of a poster session where people just walk by and talk as they like. So if feel free to chime in with questions, either unmute yourself or throw them in the chat, do as you like.
Okay. So I have a question, which is, what actions might Duke Athletics take to reduce churn once they've identified someone who is likely to churn?
Okay, so I can try and take this one. So the idea with the project itself is that they have not explicitly stated what they want to do, but the idea is for us they want these models to try and identify what those groups are so that they can try and figure out if it's marketing engagement or be discounts or whatever it is to try and engage with those people who are potentially at risk of churning. They haven't really kind of come up with the explicit strategy to try and see how do they kind of preserve or conserve them.
Let's see. I like the distinction between voluntary and involuntary churn.
Yep.
I think that's true.
I know Larry is here from Duke Athletics. You've probably had some private briefings, but do you have any questions?
No, we actually we went over it during our weekly office hours this morning, so we got some good Q&A in there. Direction, I think this is exactly what we're looking for. I think the models probably need some refinement with probably some additional third-party data. So we're hoping over the next couple of weeks we can sit down with OIT and possibly even this team to kind of dig in a little bit further to figure out next steps. I think Ryan is on also from Duke Athletics, and I don't know if Ryan has any comments in answer to the question about, you know, what could we possibly do once we understand who these accounts are.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Larry. Most importantly, and firstly, thank you to the team and to the leadership and the mentors. You know, this is an exercise that is incredibly valuable for us in athletics. We are not too proud to say that this is well outside of our wheelhouse. This is well outside of our area of expertise, and Larry knows that firsthand. You know, he's had to kind of deal with us in that respect for a little while now. But so thank you, first of all. This is incredibly helpful. I would love to dig in a little bit more on you know, the accuracy of the model and just some of how that was tested. You know, because at the end of the day, as we get to answering the questions about, in essence, okay, what do we do now, right? What do we do with this information? How does it alter the way that we are doing business? So much is to be figured out on our end. We are actually having conversations right now about potential internal restructuring, all given what has transpired relative to COVID-19 and how that has altered our ability to do business in the way that we normally had. So this comes at a good time because we are in the process of figuring out what it is we're going to do in general. And this can help shape at least some of the audience that we target with whatever those activities are, the next generation of those activities. But my first question is, because obviously 84% accuracy and 86% accuracies is, I would think, statistically very significant. Again, I don't pretend to know a great deal about this and whether those numbers are statistically significant, but it seems like they are to a layperson. And I would just love to hear more about, you know, how exactly that was tested, and is that something that we would continue to use on a large scale basis? Is that something that we would apply to an individual? You know, how would we typically use that model? Because then that'll help me maybe take it back to our team to decide the best way to use it going forward. And you know, apologies if any of that sounded incredibly elementary. That's unfortunately sort of the approach I have on all of this. So bear with me on that. But that was what I was thinking firstly.
So I'm gonna try, and in terms of the checking of performance. So currently, given the data set that you guys supplied us, which had about 200,000 records, we kind of split that down into about 40,000. That was the data set that we ended up using as the final data set for training the model. We split that up into two sets. So we used about 21,000 of the entries for the training, for creating the model. Then we used about, I think, close to 15 or 16,000 on testing the model. So that's what we're using. The two metrics that you have here is what we got for on the testing model, which was very similar to when we were training the model. Those are the kind of like similar results that we got. Now, obviously, given the very different environment that we're operating in now, we don't know how that is going to carry. The assumption is that when it comes to donors, hopefully it's not going to change too much. Obviously, That's why we deviated, because the original question was for us to do this for donors and then for season ticket holders. So we thought for season ticket holders, the environment is too different, so we can't use historical data for us to be able to create a model for that. Now, when it comes to donors, we might potentially have to make some amendments, or which I'm not sure at this point how that looks like when it comes to 2020 going into 2021, the fiscal year. But yeah, I think maybe it's trying to see maybe segregation in terms of people who have potentially churned last year, to say, who was at risk then. So most likely whoever was at risk in the previous year is most likely going to be more than likely their risk, the exposure to risk has doubled, if not increased by whatever magnitude this year. So they'll still fall into the group of people that you still want to target, or to say you want to kind of like give his marketing efforts or whatever it is. Then out of those people that we thought were kind of safe, whoever was close to the boundary, you might then want to target them, because chances are things have just kind of migrated slightly. Whoever seemed to be safe then has potentially moved into the pool of not safe anymore. Kind of, so that's what I would think.
I'll just say, Ryan, those are profound questions. These are, anytime any data science project does modeling with real data that affects a real practice, exactly those questions are what people ask. And, you know, it always depends. I think the holy grail is that it at least gives you more insight than you had before. And there's always going to be a human in the loop anyway. So. Yeah, that's great. And thank you for that. You know, and Ronald, thank you as well. You know, it certainly, at a period of time when we're almost, I mean, in some ways, we are almost starting from scratch. We really are. And whether that's a temporary new, and then we kind of fall back into our old practices, or if we use, I think a lot of organizations, frankly, are using this time to try maybe something they wouldn't have normally tried. And you can include us in that. And for a long time, we've, you know, Larry and I have pushed for more of a data-driven approach. And maybe this is the crack, you know, the door is cracked open on that, because, you know, everybody's looking for every inch that they can gain, every single percentage point that they can gain in terms of revenue. So nothing's off the table, and you know, obviously total years and lifetime amount are probably the most significant, but there are obviously other elements there. Maybe I know those were specifically mentioned, but were there others that, and I can certainly, you know, read the list, but were there any that were surprising? Were there any variables that, you know, looking at the lifetime amount they've given, the total years they've given, you know, certainly somebody that's given $10 million is probably not going to churn. And some of those might be assumed is the wrong word, but you look at that and you say, okay, well, that makes sense, right? There might not be a huge amount of insight there. It's more confirmation, I guess, than it is new insight, which is helpful in its own right, by the way, and obvious. But was there anything in there that you thought was somewhat surprising, was higher on that list than maybe you thought it would be, or was on the list at all? Because those are the things that maybe, you know, certainly we may not have thought of in the least within our organization.
I'm not sure. I think the rest of the team can take this one as well. But from my side, there was a variable called group level, and it kind of seemed like people migrated. You split people into. I'm not sure if it's almost like if it's progression by reward level or whatever it is. I'm just forgetting what the true definition of that is. But then it seemed like the higher the person went up the group, the likelihood of churning was increasing, which was very weird to me. Because you'd have thought that if somebody's kind of progressing through the chain of, if it's like a reward tiers that they're getting into, the higher they get the higher they go up the different levels, then the likelihood of churn should be decreasing. So I'm not sure whether if as they're going up the different levels, they're expecting some sort of reward or some sort of kind of like, I'm not sure if, or gifts or something from Duke that they're not getting, that if they get you as they're going up the ladder, they feel like they're no longer getting the what did I say? The right word for that.
Rewards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's no longer very beneficial to them. If it means that if the different tiers are made out of donations, the more donations that they're making to go through the different tiers, the the benefit that they're getting out of it is no longer as high for them. So they end up getting that ends up increasing the likelihood of churning. So that was quite, I thought that was pretty surprising.
Specifically on the group, I think what Ronald was talking about was as the group level goes higher, as in like group 1 to group 7, the churn or the likelihood of churning increased. But from understanding how the group levels work, I think, unless I'm wrong, that the higher group levels, like such as group 6 and group 7, actually donate a smaller amount per year. So
That's correct.
yeah. So for the group level, I guess like it did confirm what we thought the type of donor, like that is most likely to churn, the one that hasn't donated lots of money and hasn't been donating for many years. I think, in my opinion, one of the surprising variables that were somewhat significant were the fee amounts for the single ticket and the season tickets. It seemed like those had a somewhat important effect on the likelihood of churn.
Interesting. Okay.
I'll also just add that I remember being kind of surprised that none of the variables having to do with basketball stats had much use for improving the model, the predictive accuracy of the model. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I remember we did a little bit of, we incorporated some data on like annual Duke basketball rankings, sort of with the expectation that in years that, Duke had a really strong set of incoming players, the Zion year, that there would be sort of reduction in churn, and that, weaker years, there'd be an increase in churn. My understanding is that we didn't really find that to be the case.
I think that was mainly because the rankings are pretty consistent. Like Duke is actually pretty consistently ranked either 1 or 2 in for recruiting classes. So I think that's why we didn't really see a difference.
The other thing is too, and Larry, correct me if I'm wrong, because you obviously were the one that spearheaded this, but if I recall, you had even said, Larry, that there was not necessarily, it's a slightly different thing because we're talking recruiting rankings versus performance, team performance, but relative to football ticket sales, there was not a huge correlation between team performance and ticket sales that next year. So, we go to a bowl game back when that was very rare. If we went to a bowl game, the supposition would be that there'd be this influx of season tickets that next year, there'd be this huge momentum. Everybody wants to come see the team. And we really didn't see that bounce as anticipated. So it almost aligns a little bit in that regard. It's almost like the on-field, on-court product isn't necessarily as predictive as maybe some of these other pieces. So that there's a consistency there. I think, Larry, unless I'm misrepresenting what you...
No, that's correct. The only real variation from a sales or even donor perspective that we've been able to correlate is when we have Carolina football at home. So we have those alternating years where we give Carolina and Virginia Tech at home, and that really the driver in that too is predominantly single game sales, and it's so you see a fluctuation in that, and to a lot lesser degree on season tickets, we saw a little bit of correlation there, and donor levels. We see a few handful, a group of people who come in, they donate at a low level because that improves their seating for football for the Carolina home season, and then they don't donate the next year. So we do see a little bit of cyclical thing every other year with donor volumes and single game sales, but not much on this end, and really nothing on basketball. Because, and I think basketball, what you see there is once you get in the arena, nobody wants to give those seats up, right? Because they know once they do, they go to the back of the queue to get them back because there's such a long waiting list to get those seats.
So
Good
just
stuff.
just to flag on time, it's 10 minutes before the hour. The next groups are going to start at 2, so people keep asking questions. But if you want to jump over to another room, those are going to start promptly at 2. So sorry to interrupt. Go on.
No, I was just going to say any other questions or comments from the group?
And I just have one more thing. This may have been stated, so I apologize. Just a clarification on, and this is, I guess, pretty important. Churn, right? The definition that you used, is it that somebody gave 1 year and then did not give it all the next year, or that they gave 1 year but gave less the next year? And if it's the latter, was there a defined gap in either percentage? They gave 50% less, or they gave, I just wanted to make sure I was clear on that.
The team can verify, but we looked at paid dollars in one cycle and 0 paid dollars in the subsequent cycle.
Okay. So they went from whatever it was they were at, they went to 0. Is
Yep.
the definition. Okay, perfect. Well, this is great. That was all that I had. Sorry to drag down the collective data IQ on that, but thank you. Really, I'm much more representative of the athletics department than Larry is, so this is a good thing for us. We'll all be very impressed and inspired. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for presenting us with such a great problem.
Thanks for asking those questions, Ryan. I think that if you had not asked them, somebody else certainly would have, because that's the real question is how could this be deployed, and what is the model actually how useful is it against sort of a baseline that just predicts that everybody is not going to churn, for instance. So I think that's a useful question. I kind of wanted to follow up with something I introduced. I don't know if the members of the team want to talk a little bit more about like external data that we use. I know I mentioned basketball rankings, but I know that you were reaching out to other data sources, and then possibly maybe somebody wants to talk about, if one were to add to this model in the future, what sources of data do you think might be useful?
So I can touch on some of the external sources, and either Ronald or Hannah can add to that. But I think one of the sources that we took were tax rates. So we took federal tax rates and we took state tax rates. And one thing that we saw was that there were slightly more donors that were churning from 2018 to 2019, but we believe that to be an effect of how we were, our definition of churn, and how we use that in the model. But one thing that we saw was that the federal tax rates and the state tax rates didn't really have an effect on the predictive power of the model. We thought that it might be useful in capturing an effect where, because donors are donating to Duke Athletics, they might get tax breaks, and maybe different tax levels could, mean that some years it might be more of an incentive to donate or not. But we didn't find that they were too significant. So.
I think at the beginning of this project, I encouraged you to look at some census data, expecting that to be useful. Specifically, I was expecting that the median income of the census tract, or not the tract, the zip code in which the donor is located would be, I guess, positively correlated with, or negatively correlated with churn, that those living in sort of wealthier communities would be less likely to churn. But that was also, my understanding was that that was not the case. There was no connection really between median income and churn. Am I correct in that? I don't see it on the ROC for light TBM random forest thing.
Okay, so how we determined what tax rates to use we used the median income. So in essence, we kind of decided to choose one or the other, because for us to determine what brackets we had to use the income. So then it would have just introduced correlations. So we just end up using just the tax rates. Potentially, maybe we could have used the other one, just the median income, and not use the tax rates. But yeah, the result potentially would have been very similar.
So I hate to cut off this really interesting discussion. I just want to get group 16 up. Thank you all for an amazing summer. Thank you, Andrew, for leading a team, and Duke Athletics for such a great problem.